In the desert of New Mexico, just before dawn on July 16, 1945, a storm rolled across a dry lakebed with a name that already sounded like an omen: Jornada del Muerto, the Journey of the Dead. Lightning flashed over a strange steel tower that rose alone out of the sand, topped with a fat, clumsy-looking metal sphere the size of a small car. Inside that sphere was the most complex explosive device ever built by human hands. Around it, buried in the desert, ran cables, diagnostic lines, cameras, blast gauges, and field instruments tuned to capture every possible detail of what would happen when it went off. The code name for this device was simple: the Gadget. The code name for the test, chosen by a literary physicist who loved John Donne and Hindu scripture, was more mysterious: Trinity. Standing in that storm, watching the clock tick towards zero, was the man who had made it all possible from the military side. Not a scientist, not a philosopher, but a U.S. Army engineer with a reputation for getting huge, impossible jobs done on time and under budget. His name was Major General Leslie Richard Groves. He had built the Pentagon. He had built a secret industrial empire from Tennessee to Washington State, and now he was about to find out whether 3 years of the hardest crash program in history had created what he privately called a weapon of almost apocalyptic power, or a very expensive dud. Before Groves ever saw Trinity's flash, he had already done something that stunned even his fellow officers. He turned theoretical physics into a continent-spanning logistics operation. When he took command of the Manhattan Engineer District in September 1942, the bomb was still mostly equations on chalkboards and arguments in conference rooms. The basic idea of a fission weapon was known, but nobody had ever tried to build one. No one knew how much uranium-235 could be separated from natural uranium, or whether plutonium from reactors could be turned into a workable core. Groves changed that by doing something the Soviet Union would struggle to copy for decades. He married cutting-edge science to truly massive industrial engineering at speed. He oversaw the choice and construction of Oak Ridge, Tennessee, turning a valley into a secret city with huge electromagnetic, gaseous diffusion, and thermal plants to enrich uranium, staffed by tens of thousands of workers who knew only they were helping the war. He pushed through Hanford, Washington, building entire reactor complexes and chemical separation plants from scratch to breed and extract plutonium. He greenlit Los Alamos, a remote mesa in New Mexico, as the central weapons design laboratory, and chose the brilliant Mercurial J. Robert Oppenheimer to lead the scientific side, a decision many contemporaries thought reckless, but that proved essential. By 1945, this invisible empire employed more than 130,000 people and had cost roughly $2 billion wartime dollars, about the cost of the entire U.S. automobile industry in 1941. All of it run under a single army district, guarded by barbed wire and security clearances, directed by a general whose job was to keep the scientists moving and the leaks plugged. From Moscow's point of view, this project would, after the war, be a revelation. An entire parallel nation of factories, reactors, rail lines, and laboratories had been built in under 3 years, coordinated across the continent, fed by some of the most advanced industrial management and engineering talent on Earth, and they had barely heard a whisper about it. Trinity was the moment when all that invisible effort turned into something you could actually see. The device atop the Trinity Tower was not a simple bomb. It was the end product of countless failed calculations and recalculations, something that pushed American science and engineering into territory no one had walked before. Early on, Los Alamos had planned to use a gun-type design for both uranium and plutonium, fire one lump of fissile material into another to form a supercritical mass and set off a chain reaction. That design would work for highly enriched uranium, but plutonium from the new Hanford reactors came with an impurity, plutonium-240, which emitted spontaneous neutrons and threatened to cause premature detonation if used in a gun-type assembly. The only way forward was a completely different approach: implosion. Surround a plutonium core with carefully shaped lenses of conventional explosives, fire them all at once, and use the returning shock waves to crush the core inward, turning a subcritical mass into a supercritical one for a fraction of a microsecond. It sounds straightforward, but to make it work, Americans had to invent a new level of explosive science: three-dimensional shock modeling, fast electrical detonators that would all fire within millionths of a second of each other, metallurgy and machining techniques to shape the core and its tamper to mind-bending precision. By late 1944, the scientists led by Oppenheimer concluded that the implosion design was the only one that would work for plutonium, and Los Alamos betting everything on what they nicknamed the Christie gadget, after theorist Robert Christie, who showed that a solid plutonium sphere could be made to implode reliably. From Groves's perspective, this was both good news and a nightmare. Good, because if it worked, the United States would have a compact, efficient weapon ready not just for one city, but for many. Bad, because not a single full-scale test had been done. In Washington, he had to brief leaders based on lab calculations and small-scale experiments, but as an engineer, he trusted only one kind of proof: real-world performance. Trinity would give him that data, or reveal a multi-billion-dollar failure. The run-up to Trinity looked less like a lab experiment and more like a secret military campaign. On the Jornada del Muerto site, crews under Groves built access roads, power lines, barracks, bunkers, and a 30-meter steel tower strong enough to hold the gadget. They ringed the test ground with instrument bunkers at 10,000 yards in several directions to measure blast pressure, heat, and radiation, plus cameras placed in armored housing, and even high-speed spectrographs to read the light of the bomb like a fingerprint. Before betting everything on the gadget, Groves ordered a 100-ton test in May 1945, 108 tons of TNT stacked on a tower and laced with radioactive material from reactors, detonated to calibrate instruments and practice radiological sampling. Stafford Warren, the medical officer responsible for radiation safety, later reported that this trial run was successful and gave vital data on how to operate in a contaminated environment, something nobody else on Earth knew how to do at that scale. As the July test approached, Groves was not just thinking about physics, he was thinking about what would happen if something horribly went wrong. He stationed soldiers in nearby towns with orders to help evacuate civilians if needed. He quietly warned the governor of New Mexico that martial law might have to be imposed if the device scattered dangerous fallout toward populated areas. Army public relations officers drafted a cover story blaming any unexplained blast on an accidental explosion at a distant ammunition depot in case the test went catastrophically off script. In other words, while scientists obsessed over cross-sections and detonator timing, Groves obsessed over blast radii, wind patterns, and contingency plans covering everything from wildfire to mass casualties. It was a mindset Soviet commanders would later recognize and respect when they studied American test operations after they built their own bomb. Then, nature decided to test Groves's nerves. In the hours before the scheduled 4 a.m. detonation on July 16, 1945, a thunderstorm swept over the range. Lightning lit up the tower like a ghostly scaffold. Rain lashed the desert. Winds shifted unpredictably, threatening to blow the radioactive cloud over nearby ranches and settlements. In the cramped control bunker S-10,000, Oppenheimer and his team argued about postponing. Every hour of delay increased the chance of mechanical failure in the gadget and the field systems, but a shot in the middle of a storm could be far worse than a failed test. Groves listened. He had brought in meteorologist Jack Hubbard to forecast a narrow window of acceptable weather, and now he pinned him down. Hubbard said the optimal conditions would appear between 5 and 6 a.m. Groves, with his usual black humor, told him, "If you're wrong, I'll hang you." That exchange says a lot about the difference between American and Soviet practice at that moment. Groves had real-time meteorological data, a trained forecast staff, and the authority to move a billion-dollar test inside a one-hour window based on their advice. His Soviet counterparts, a few years later, would have to improvise many of these capabilities as they rushed to catch up. Around 1 a.m., Groves and Oppenheimer met privately. They agreed to stick with a shot near 5:30 if the storm cleared. Then Groves did something that astonished the scientists. He went back to his quarters and slept. Years later, he would brag about it. For him, sleep that night was a demonstration of command, calm under pressure, confidence in the system he had built. For many in Los Alamos, it was almost alien. How could the man responsible for the most powerful device ever made close his eyes on the night before it was used? But that, in a way, was the American advantage. Groves trusted not just in brains, but in process, in the thousands of checklists, quality control steps, and redundant systems that made the gadget more than just a physics experiment. It was a product of an industrial machine that, at that moment, no other country on Earth had. Just before 5:30 a.m., Groves and Oppenheimer met privately. They agreed to stick with a shot near 5:30 if the storm cleared. Then Groves did something that astonished the scientists. He went back to his quarters and slept. Just before 5:30 a.m., Groves left the forward area near the bunker and drove back to the base camp, a safer distance for the final countdown. He and senior officials like James Conant and Vannevar Bush took up positions with a clear line of sight to the tower, miles away. The official control station at S-10,000, staffed by Oppenheimer and key experimenters, started a 20-minute countdown over loudspeakers. At T-2 minutes, everyone not essential to the firing sequence was ordered to lie down with their feet toward ground zero, eyes closed, facing away, with either welder's glass or hands over their faces. Groves followed his own rules. He lay down on the desert floor at base camp, boots pointed toward the tower, eyes shielded. In his report, he later wrote that in those last seconds, his mind was fixed not on glory, but on a single cold fear. What if, when the count reached zero, nothing happened? At 5:29:45 a.m. on July 16, 1945, something happened. Groves, like everyone else, saw it first as pure light. Even with his eyes closed and covered, he registered what witnesses later called a light brighter than several suns, turning the desert dawn into instant noon in all directions. After a second or two, he dared to turn and look through darkened glass. He saw a furious, glowing ball, a fireball boiling and rising, colors shifting from white to yellow to orange to deep red as it grew. In his own words, the lighting effects beggared description. He called the explosion unprecedented, magnificent, beautiful, stupendous, and terrifying. From his vantage point, the scale was unlike anything any artillery officer had ever seen. The fireball climbed, slowed, and then turned into the now famous mushroom cloud, a column of dust and vapor shooting upward, the cap flattening and spreading into the upper air as the ground below flickered with residual flames. For a few heartbeats, there was silence. Then the blast wave arrived. Groves and the others at base camp felt a hot whip of air hit them, followed by a deep rolling thunder that echoed off distant hills. Towns over 100 miles away were shattered. Ranchers later reported thinking an ammunition train had exploded. Groves stood up, dusted himself off, and looked at Conant and Bush. According to accounts, the three men simply shook hands. No cheering, no speeches, just the understanding that the thing they had gambled so much on was real. In that moment, different people saw different things. Some scientists, like Kenneth Bainbridge, the Trinity test director, are remembered for turning to Oppenheimer and saying, "Now we are all sons of bitches," a bitter acknowledgement that they had created something history would judge as terrible, no matter the wartime justification. Oppenheimer himself, years later, would remember a line from the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds," framing the test as a kind of mythic crossing of a moral threshold. Groves saw, first and foremost, a weapon. Within days, he was reading technical evaluations with the same cool eye he had used to inspect bridges and foundations. Radiochemical sampling and blast measurements suggested a yield of roughly 15 to 20 kilotons of TNT equivalent, right in the range that implied a single bomb could wipe out a city center. The steel tower that had held the gadget, 100 feet tall and engineered to be sturdy, had almost completely vaporized. The ground below it had been fused into a glassy green substance, later called trinitite. In a follow-up summary for his superiors, Groves reported that glass had shattered 125 miles away and that the fireball was brighter than several suns at midday. He admitted something he had not said before, that seeing the Trinity results, he no longer believed even the Pentagon itself could be considered a safe shelter against such a weapon. That realization was his real shock. For a career engineer and soldier, hardened to the idea of killing and dying in war, it was not the morality of mass destruction that hit first, it was the geometry of vulnerability. Any fixed target, however thick its walls, could now be erased if an enemy ever got a similar device into the air above it. No fortress, no HQ, no capital was truly out of reach. At the same time, Trinity confirmed what a handful of others in Washington had been wagering for 3 years, that the United States had just leapt into a new era of warfare that no other power could immediately follow. The implosion design had worked. The industrial pipeline from Hanford to Los Alamos to Tinian would be able to feed real bombs into real planes over real targets. Even before Trinity, some scientists had floated the idea of a demonstration shot, exploding a bomb on an uninhabited island or over a deserted area to scare Japan into surrender without killing civilians. Groves listened, but he was unconvinced, partly because until Trinity, he didn't know the weapon would work at all. Partly because even if it did, a single remote test might not move a fanatical enemy government. After Trinity, his position hardened. The data in front of him showed a device that was reliable, devastating, and ready. His responsibility, as he understood it, was to end the war as fast as possible and to demonstrate to friend and foe alike, including the Soviet Union, exactly what American science and industry could now do. When Captain William Parsons sent Groves a memo arguing against a purely symbolic test and stressing that the first use should be militarily effective, Oppenheimer himself wrote to Groves saying he agreed completely. The shock they wanted to deliver was not just technical, but psychological, a blow so terrifying that no government would doubt the new American capability. Within weeks, the technology proven at Trinity would be unleashed on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Groves, in post-war interviews and his memoir, Now It Can Be Told, never expressed regret about that link. To him, Trinity was a test that validated the weapon. The bombings were its logical and necessary operational use to end a total war on terms the United States dictated. In the years that followed, as details of the Manhattan Project and Trinity gradually leaked into public view, Soviet scientists and strategists pored over everything they could get. They saw that the American program had not been a single lab on a hilltop, but an integrated system. Precision implosion research at Los Alamos, vast enrichment plants at Oak Ridge, giant plutonium reactors and separation plants at Hanford, high-speed diagnostics and radiochemistry developed around Trinity, and a command structure that could coordinate it all under a single general. They saw, too, how Trinity had been measured. Geoffrey Taylor in Britain famously estimated the bomb's yield just from the published photos of the fireball using the laws of blast wave scaling, work that quietly impressed and alarmed Soviet planners. If Western scientists could back-calculate yields from pictures, nobody's tests would stay secret for long. Enrico Fermi's casual trick of dropping scraps of paper as the blast wave passed and estimating the yield from how far they moved became legend, a symbol of how deeply embedded physics was in American military culture by 1945. From Moscow's vantage point, Trinity was a slap in the face. They had excellent physicists, but they did not have, yet, the industrial depth, the computational tools, the logistics, or the freedom to assemble such a team and fund it lavishly on pure trust. They raced to close the gap, succeeding in 1949 with their own first test, helped by espionage but still facing years of scrambling to catch the American lead in weapons design and testing technology. Groves's calm handshake in the desert, his technical report talking about several suns and torn-off towers, was the first piece of that new balance of terror. He saw an apoplectic weapon and immediately started thinking like an engineer about how many you'd need, how you'd deploy them, how you'd build hardened sites and plan dispersal. Scientists like Bainbridge and Oppenheimer saw, at least in hindsight, something closer to a moral abyss. For American viewers today, that contrast is part of the fascination. On one side, there is an almost unbelievable display of capability, a country that could pour billions into secret factories, solve impossible physics problems, build a perfect high-explosive implosion system, and then detonate a device so powerful that its light flooded towns 180 miles away, and its shockwave broke windows 100 miles from ground zero. Within the other, there is the unsettling knowledge that this achievement put humanity on a knife edge. As some historians argue, Trinity was the first time it became realistic to imagine that our species could wipe itself out with its own inventions. The Soviets, when they learned about Trinity and saw the photos of the mushroom cloud, were not just shocked by the weapon. They were shocked by everything behind it: the scale of American industry, the integration of science and the military, the speed with which a democracy had mobilized the best minds and the biggest factories, out-engineering both Nazi Germany and now any possible rival. For General Leslie Groves, that morning in July was confirmation that this system worked. For the rest of the world, it was the moment when power itself changed shape. From then on, war would not just be about divisions and fleets, but about who could build, manage, and control technologies whose consequences reached past any battlefield and into the fate of civilization itself. When Americans watch the story of Trinity today, especially through the lens of Cold War rivalry, they are not just watching a big explosion in the desert. They are watching the moment that the United States stepped into a kind of terrible leadership, one that left both enemies and allies staring, stunned at a sky lit up brighter than several suns, and wondering what kind of future that light had just burned into being.